Mexican Expedition, 1916 to 1917. The Mexican expedition arose from Pancho Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico, in March 1916, the first foreign attack on continental United States since the War of 1812. This military operation tested American ability to project force across difficult terrain while maintaining neutrality in World War I. Villa's attack killed 17 Americans and destroyed property, creating public demand for military response. President Wilson authorized General John J. Pershing to lead a punitive expedition into Mexico to capture Villa and disperse his forces. The expedition faced enormous challenges including vast distances, difficult terrain, and lack of cooperation from Mexican government forces. Pershing's forces included regular army units and National Guard formations, providing valuable training for future World War I service. Operations involved cavalry, infantry, and early use of military aircraft and motor vehicles. The expedition demonstrated both the potential and limitations of new military technologies in harsh environments. Despite extensive searching, Villa eluded capture, and the expedition achieved only limited success in disrupting his organization. Growing tensions with Germany over submarine warfare eventually forced American withdrawal to concentrate on European threats. The expedition provided crucial experience for American military leaders and revealed weaknesses in Army organization and equipment. Pershing's performance during this operation contributed to his selection as commander of American forces in World War I. World War I, 1917 to 1918, U.S. involvement. American entry into World War I marked the nation's emergence as a global power and decisive factor in international conflicts. The United States maintained neutrality for 3 years before German submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram forced military intervention. President Wilson's decision to request war declaration reflected both immediate provocations and broader concerns about democratic values. The slogan, "Make the world safe for democracy," captured American idealism about the war's purposes. The American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Pershing arrived in Europe at a critical moment when Allied forces faced potential defeat. American insistence on maintaining independent command structures initially created tension with European allies. American forces participated in major offensives including Belleau Wood, where Marines earned lasting reputation for tenacity, and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest American military operation to that date. These battles demonstrated American fighting effectiveness and determination. The war revolutionized American society, expanding federal power, promoting women's rights, and accelerating racial tensions. The draft system demonstrated government's capacity for mass mobilization while revealing social divisions. American participation proved decisive in achieving Allied victory, though at considerable cost with over 116,000 deaths. The war established the United States as a major world power but also revealed American ambivalence about international leadership, as demonstrated by Senate rejection of the League of Nations. World War II, 1941 to 1945. World War II represented the greatest military challenge in American history, requiring total mobilization of national resources and fundamentally transforming the United States into a global superpower. American entry followed the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which killed over 2,400 Americans and destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet. The war required fighting on multiple fronts against technologically advanced enemies with established military advantages. The Germany First strategy reflected strategic priorities while maintaining defensive operations in the Pacific until sufficient resources became available for offensive action. D-Day, the Normandy invasion of June 6, 1944, demonstrated American capacity for complex amphibious operations and marked the beginning of Nazi Germany's defeat. The operation required unprecedented coordination between Allied forces and established principles for future joint operations. Pacific theater operations featured innovative island-hopping campaigns that bypassed heavily defended Japanese positions while securing bases for further advances. Battles at Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa demonstrated both American tactical skill and Japanese determination to fight to the death. The decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains controversial but ended the war without requiring invasion of Japan. The bombs demonstrated American technological superiority and ushered in the nuclear age. World War II casualties exceeded 400,000 American deaths while global deaths reached 70 to 85 million. The war's outcome established American leadership of the free world and created international institutions designed to prevent future global conflicts. Korean War, 1950 to 1953. The Korean War tested American commitment to containing communism and demonstrated the challenges of limited warfare in the nuclear age. The conflict began when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25, 1950, seeking to unify Korea under communist rule. President Truman's decision to intervene reflected Cold War fears about communist expansion and the domino theory. United Nations authorization provided international legitimacy while the decision to fight without formal war declaration established precedent for future conflicts. Initial North Korean success pushed American and South Korean forces into the Pusan perimeter, threatening complete defeat. General Douglas MacArthur's Incheon landing in September 1950 reversed the military situation and enabled UN forces to advance into North Korea. Chinese intervention in November 1950 transformed the conflict and created a military stalemate. The entry of hundreds of thousands of Chinese volunteers prevented UN victory and forced a long, costly war of attrition. MacArthur's dismissal by Truman in April 1951 established civilian control over military policy and demonstrated presidential authority to limit military operations despite popular support for expanded warfare. The armistice signed July 27, 1953, ended active fighting but left Korea divided at approximately the same line where the war began. Over 36,000 Americans died in a conflict that established American willingness to fight limited wars to contain communism while avoiding nuclear escalation. Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. The Vietnam War became the longest and most controversial conflict in American history, ultimately resulting in the first clear military defeat for United States forces. The war emerged from Cold War commitments to prevent communist expansion in Southeast Asia and evolved into a prolonged struggle that divided American society. American involvement began with military advisors supporting South Vietnamese forces against communist insurgents backed by North Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 provided justification for major military escalation under President Lyndon Johnson. The conflict featured guerrilla warfare, jungle combat, and extensive use of helicopters and air power. The Viet Cong's tunnel networks, booby traps, and hit-and-run tactics negated American technological advantages and inflicted heavy casualties. The Tet Offensive of 1968, though a military defeat for communist forces, turned American public opinion against the war by demonstrating the enemy's continued strength and resolve. Television coverage brought the war's brutality into American homes, creating unprecedented domestic opposition. President Nixon's Vietnamization policy attempted to transfer fighting responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops. The invasion of Cambodia in 1970 intensified domestic protests and congressional opposition. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 ended American involvement, but North Vietnamese forces conquered South Vietnam in 1975. Over 58,000 Americans died in a war that failed to achieve its objectives and left lasting scars on American society and military policy. Invasion of Grenada, 1983. Operation Urgent Fury, the invasion of Grenada, marked the first major American military operation since Vietnam and demonstrated renewed willingness to use force in support of foreign policy objectives. The operation arose from concerns about Cuban influence and threats to American medical students on the island. The Marxist government of Maurice Bishop had been overthrown by more radical forces, creating instability and raising fears about American citizens' safety. President Reagan authorized military intervention to restore order and evacuate American nationals. The operation involved approximately 7,000 American troops from multiple services, providing valuable experience in joint operations. Initial intelligence failures and communication problems revealed weaknesses in military coordination that required correction. Despite these difficulties, American forces quickly overwhelmed Cuban and Grenadian resistance, securing the island within days. The evacuation of American medical students proceeded smoothly, justifying the operation's humanitarian objectives. The invasion restored a pro-American government and eliminated Cuban military presence on the island. Though criticized internationally, the operation proved popular domestically and demonstrated that the Vietnam Syndrome had not permanently paralyzed American military policy. The Grenada invasion provided important lessons for future operations, particularly the need for improved intelligence, better inter-service coordination, and more effective media relations during military operations. Invasion of Panama, 1989. Operation Just Cause removed Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega and demonstrated American commitment to fighting international drug trafficking. The operation reflected growing concerns about Noriega's involvement in drug smuggling and his increasingly hostile relationship with the United States. Noriega's annulment of presidential elections and harassment of American military personnel provided immediate justification for intervention. The death of an American officer at a Panamanian roadblock triggered final preparations for military action. The invasion involved approximately 27,000 American troops using advanced military technology, including stealth aircraft, in their first combat operation. The operation demonstrated improvements in joint operations and precision targeting since Grenada. American forces quickly secured key objectives including airfields, military bases, and government buildings. Noriega initially evaded capture but eventually surrendered after seeking refuge in the Vatican embassy. The operation succeeded in removing Noriega, who was transported to the United States for trial on drug trafficking charges. A new democratic government was installed under Guillermo Endara, who had won the annulled elections. Operation Just Cause cost 23 American lives and an estimated 500 Panamanian deaths. The invasion demonstrated American military effectiveness but raised questions about international law and the use of force to achieve domestic policy objectives. Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, 1990 to 1991. The Gulf War demonstrated American military superiority and the effectiveness of international coalition warfare. The conflict arose from Iraq's invasion of Kuwait on August 2, 1990, which threatened regional stability and global oil supplies. President George H.W. Bush assembled a broad international coalition and secured United Nations authorization for military action. The deployment of over 500,000 American troops to Saudi Arabia showed American commitment to regional allies and deterred further Iraqi aggression. Operation Desert Shield, the defensive phase, prevented Iraqi attacks on Saudi Arabia while building combat strength. The air campaign that began January 17, 1991, demonstrated precision bombing capabilities and degraded Iraqi military effectiveness. The ground campaign, lasting only 100 hours, achieved complete victory with minimal Allied casualties. Advanced American technology including GPS navigation, precision-guided munitions, and night vision equipment overwhelmed Iraqi forces. Iraqi forces retreated from Kuwait after destroying oil wells and other infrastructure. The decision to end combat operations without removing Saddam Hussein reflected limited war objectives and coalition unity. The Gulf War restored American confidence in military capabilities and demonstrated the effectiveness of professional armed forces using advanced technology. The conflict established precedents for future humanitarian interventions and coalition warfare. Somalia Intervention, 1992 to 1994. The Somalia intervention, officially known as Operation Restore Hope, began in December 1992 as a humanitarian mission that evolved into one of America's most challenging military operations of the 1990s. Somalia had descended into chaos following the collapse of Siad Barre's government in 1991, leaving the country without effective governance and triggering a devastating famine that killed over 300,000 people. President George H.W. Bush authorized the deployment of 28,000 American troops as part of a United Nations coalition, initially focused on protecting food distribution and restoring order. The mission seemed straightforward: secure ports and airports, escort food convoys, and create safe zones for humanitarian aid. However, the situation rapidly deteriorated under President Bill Clinton's administration when the mission expanded to include nation-building and capturing warlord Mohammed Farah aided. The operation's defining moment came on October 3, 1993, during the Battle of Mogadishu. What began as a routine raid to capture Aidid's lieutenants turned into an 18-hour urban firefight when 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down. U.S. Rangers and Delta Force soldiers found themselves surrounded in hostile territory, fighting house to house against thousands of Somali militia members and civilians. The battle resulted in 18 American deaths and 73 wounded, while Somali casualties numbered in the hundreds. Images of dead American soldiers being dragged through Mogadishu's streets shocked the American public and fundamentally changed U.S. attitudes toward humanitarian interventions. President Clinton announced the withdrawal of all U.S. forces by March 1994. The Somalia intervention highlighted the complexities of modern peacekeeping and humanitarian missions. It demonstrated how quickly humanitarian operations could become military quagmires and established what became known as the Somalia Syndrome, American reluctance to engage in overseas operations without clear objectives and exit strategies. The mission's lessons would influence U.S. foreign policy decisions for decades, particularly regarding interventions in Rwanda, Bosnia, and later conflicts in the Middle East. Bosnian War Intervention, 1995. The U.S. intervention in the Bosnian War marked America's decisive entry into the Balkans conflict that had raged since 1992. Following the breakup of Yugoslavia, Bosnia-Herzegovina became the epicenter of ethnic violence between Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats. By 1995, over 100,000 people had died, and millions were displaced in what became Europe's deadliest conflict since World War II. Initially, the United States remained reluctant to intervene directly, preferring diplomatic solutions and supporting European-led peacekeeping efforts. However, mounting international pressure and horrific incidents like the Srebrenica massacre in July 1995, where Bosnian Serb forces killed over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys, forced President Bill Clinton to act decisively. Operation Deliberate Force began on August 30, 1995, as a NATO bombing campaign led primarily by American forces. For 3 weeks, U.S. and NATO aircraft conducted over 3,500 sorties against Bosnian Serb positions, command centers, and military infrastructure. The precision bombing campaign targeted air defense systems, ammunition depots, and communication networks while carefully avoiding civilian casualties. The bombing coincided with a ground offensive by the Croatian army and Bosnian forces, rapidly shifting the military balance. Bosnian Serb forces, isolated and under intense pressure, agreed to negotiate. The bombing campaign successfully brought all parties to the negotiating table in Dayton, Ohio. The Dayton Peace Accords, signed in December 1995, officially ended the Bosnian War and established the framework for peace. The agreement created 2 main entities within Bosnia, the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Republika Srpska, with significant international oversight. Following the peace agreement, the U.S. deployed approximately 20,000 troops as part of the NATO Implementation Force, e.t.c., later reorganized as the Stabilization Force, SFOR. American forces remained in Bosnia for nearly a decade, helping maintain peace and supporting democratic institutions. The Bosnian intervention demonstrated the effectiveness of limited, precision military action combined with diplomacy. It restored NATO's credibility and established precedents for humanitarian intervention that would influence future operations in Kosovo, Libya, and beyond. Kosovo War, 1999. The Kosovo War represented NATO's first major combat operation and America's commitment to preventing genocide in Europe. The conflict emerged from escalating tensions between Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic's Serbian forces and the Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, which sought independence for the ethnic Albanian majority in Kosovo province. By early 1999, Serbian forces had launched a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing against Kosovo's Albanian population. Approximately 10,000 people had been killed, and over 800,000 Albanians were displaced from their homes. International efforts to negotiate a peaceful solution failed when Milosevic rejected the Rambouillet Agreement in March 1999. President Bill Clinton, supported by NATO allies, authorized Operation Allied Force on March 24, 1999. The bombing campaign began with strikes against Yugoslav air defenses, military installations, and government facilities in Belgrade. Initially planned as a brief operation, the campaign extended for 78 days as Milosevic proved more resilient than expected. The air war featured cutting-edge technology, including stealth bombers, precision-guided munitions, and extensive use of intelligence gathering. American forces conducted the majority of sorties, with over 1,000 aircraft participating in the operation. Notable incidents included the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade and the downing of an F-117 stealth fighter by Serbian forces. As the bombing intensified, Serbian forces accelerated their ethnic cleansing campaign, forcing nearly 1 million Albanians to flee to neighboring countries. The humanitarian crisis strengthened international resolve to continue the bombing despite growing concerns about civilian casualties and the war's duration. The campaign's turning point came when NATO began targeting civilian infrastructure, including bridges, power plants, and television stations, significantly impacting Serbian society. Facing increasing international isolation and the threat of a ground invasion, Milosevic finally agreed to withdraw Serbian forces from Kosovo on June 9, 1999. The Kosovo intervention established important precedents for humanitarian intervention without UN Security Council authorization. It demonstrated NATO's post-Cold War relevance and America's willingness to use military force to prevent genocide, even when direct U.S. interests weren't immediately threatened. War in Afghanistan, 2001 to 2021. The war in Afghanistan became America's longest military conflict, spanning nearly 2 decades and 4 presidential administrations. The war began as a direct response to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, when al-Qaeda operatives trained in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan killed nearly 3,000 Americans in coordinated strikes on New York City and Washington, D.C. President George W. Bush demanded that Afghanistan's Taliban government surrender al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden and close terrorist training camps. When the Taliban refused, Bush authorized Operation Enduring Freedom on October 7, 2001. The initial campaign combined precision bombing with support for the Northern Alliance, an anti-Taliban coalition that had been fighting the regime since 1996. The conventional phase proved remarkably successful. Within 2 months, Taliban forces collapsed, and major cities including Kabul and Kandahar fell to coalition forces. However, both bin Laden and Taliban leader Mullah Omar escaped, and many fighters melted away into Pakistan's tribal regions, setting the stage for a prolonged insurgency. The mission quickly expanded beyond counterterrorism to include nation-building, democratization, and reconstruction. The U.S. established a new Afghan government under Hamid Karzai, began training Afghan security forces, and invested billions in development projects. However, the Taliban regrouped and launched an increasingly effective insurgency, exploiting government corruption, ethnic tensions, and popular resentment against foreign occupation. Key phases included the surge under President Obama, who deployed an additional 30,000 troops in 2009 to implement a counterinsurgency strategy. The mission achieved its primary objective when U.S. Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan in May 2011, but violence in Afghanistan continued unabated. The war's human cost was enormous. Over 2,400 American service members died, along with thousands of Allied troops and tens of thousands of Afghan civilians. Financial costs exceeded $2 trillion, making it one of America's most expensive conflicts. President Biden completed the withdrawal in August 2021, ending America's military presence as the Taliban rapidly regained control of the country, raising questions about the war's ultimate achievements and America's approach to nation-building. Iraq War, 2003 to 2011. The Iraq War began on March 20, 2003, when President George W. Bush authorized the invasion of Iraq, launching what would become one of America's most controversial military interventions. The The Bush administration justified the war by claiming that Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, supported international terrorism, and posed an imminent threat to regional stability and U.S. security. The invasion, dubbed Operation Iraqi Freedom, featured a shock and awe campaign designed to rapidly overwhelm Iraqi forces through overwhelming firepower and technological superiority. Coalition forces, led by approximately 150,000 American troops, advanced rapidly through Iraq, encountering minimal resistance from the Iraqi military. Baghdad fell on April 9, 2003, and President Bush declared major combat operations complete on May 1, 2003. However, the swift military victory quickly gave way to a complex and deadly insurgency. No WMDs were found, undermining the war's primary justification and damaging American credibility internationally. The disbanding of the Iraqi military and de-Baathification policies eliminated experienced administrators and security personnel, creating a power vacuum that insurgent groups exploited. Multiple insurgencies emerged, including former regime loyalists, foreign jihadists, and sectarian militias. The situation deteriorated dramatically after the 2006 bombing of the Golden Mosque in Samarra, which triggered widespread sectarian violence between Sunni and Shia Muslims. At its peak, Iraq experienced thousands of civilian deaths monthly, and American casualties mounted steadily. President Bush authorized a surge strategy in 2007, deploying an additional 30,000 troops under General David Petraeus to implement a comprehensive counterinsurgency approach. The surge, combined with the awakening movement where Sunni tribes turned against al-Qaeda in Iraq, significantly reduced violence levels. President Obama fulfilled his campaign promise to end the Iraq War, withdrawing the last U.S. combat forces in December 2011. However, the withdrawal left Iraq vulnerable to new threats, including the rise of ISIS, which seized large portions of Iraqi territory in 2014. The Iraq War resulted in over 4,400 American military deaths and estimates of Iraqi civilian casualties ranging from 100,000 to over 600,000. The conflict's legacy continues to influence American foreign policy debates about intervention, nation-building, and the use of military force. Operation Inherent Resolve, ISIS War, 2014–present. Operation Inherent Resolve represents the United States' ongoing campaign against the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, a terrorist organization that emerged from the chaos following the Iraq War and Syrian civil war. ISIS shocked the world in 2014 by rapidly seizing territory across Iraq and Syria, establishing a self-proclaimed caliphate and committing horrific atrocities including mass executions, enslavement, and genocide against Yazidi minorities. The crisis reached a turning point in August 2014 when ISIS forces trapped thousands of Yazidi civilians on Mount Sinjar and threatened to overrun Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan. President Barack Obama authorized humanitarian airdrops and precision airstrikes to protect threatened populations and prevent a potential genocide. The operation expanded rapidly as ISIS continued its territorial gains and international provocations, including the brutal executions of American journalists James Foley and Stephen Sotloff. Obama assembled a broad international coalition of over 80 countries, though military participation varied significantly among members. The campaign employed a comprehensive strategy combining precision airstrikes, special operations raids, training and equipping local partners, intelligence sharing, and efforts to counter ISIS's sophisticated propaganda and recruitment networks. Unlike previous conflicts, the U.S. relied heavily on Kurdish Peshmerga forces, Iraqi security forces, and Syrian Democratic Forces rather than deploying large numbers of American ground troops. Key victories included the liberation of major cities like Ramadi, Fallujah, Mosul, and Raqqa, ISIS's de facto capital. The Battle of Mosul, 2016 to 2017, proved particularly significant as Iraqi forces, supported by U.S. advisors and air power, reclaimed Iraq's second-largest city after 9 months of intense urban warfare. The campaign achieved remarkable success in dismantling ISIS's territorial caliphate. By 2019, the organization had lost over 99% of its territory and seen its leadership decimated, including the death of leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in a U.S. Special Operations raid. However, ISIS adapted to territorial losses by reverting to guerrilla tactics and inspiring attacks worldwide. The organization continues to pose security challenges in both Iraq and Syria, requiring ongoing coalition efforts to prevent its resurgence and address the underlying conditions that enabled its rise. Operation Inherent Resolve demonstrates the evolution of American counterterrorism strategy, emphasizing partnerships with local forces and limited but sustained military engagement. Libya Intervention, 2011. The Libya intervention of 2011 emerged from the Arab Spring uprisings that swept across the Middle East and North Africa. In February 2011, protests against Muammar Gaddafi's 42-year dictatorship erupted in Benghazi and quickly spread across Libya. Gaddafi's regime responded with brutal force, using military aircraft, artillery, and mercenaries against civilian protesters, threatening what many observers feared could become a massacre. International pressure mounted rapidly as Gaddafi's forces advanced toward Benghazi, Libya's second-largest city and the rebellion's stronghold. Gaddafi's ominous promise to hunt down opponents, house by house, and show no mercy raised alarms about potential genocide. The Arab League, African Union, and United Nations condemned the regime's violence and called for international action. President Barack Obama, initially reluctant to engage in another Middle Eastern conflict, was persuaded by a coalition of advisors including Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and National Security Council staff who advocated for the responsibility to protect doctrine. On March 17, 2011, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 1973, authorizing member states to take all necessary measures to protect Libyan civilians. Operation Odyssey Dawn began on March 19, 2011, with U.S., British, and French forces launching cruise missiles and airstrikes against Gaddafi's air defenses and military installations. The initial phase aimed to establish a no-fly zone and prevent regime forces from attacking civilian areas. Within days, NATO assumed control of the operation, renaming it Operation Unified Protector. The intervention evolved from protecting civilians to actively supporting rebel forces seeking Gaddafi's overthrow. Coalition aircraft conducted over 26,000 sorties, including 9,700 strike missions that systematically degraded Gaddafi's military capabilities. The campaign featured extensive use of precision-guided munitions, intelligence gathering, and coordination with rebel ground forces. The intervention achieved its immediate objective when rebel forces, supported by NATO air power, captured Tripoli in August 2011 and killed Gaddafi in October. However, the aftermath proved chaotic as Libya fragmented into competing factions, militias, and regional governments. The Libya intervention sparked intense debate about American foreign policy, presidential war powers, and the effectiveness of humanitarian intervention. While supporters argued it prevented potential genocide, critics contended that the lack of post-conflict planning contributed to Libya's ongoing instability and highlighted the limitations of military solutions to political problems. Yemen conflict, U.S. involvement, ongoing since 2015. The United States' involvement in the Yemen conflict represents one of the most complex and controversial aspects of American foreign policy in the Middle East. The conflict began in 2014 when Houthi rebels, officially known as Ansar Allah, seized control of Yemen's capital, Sana'a, and forced the internationally recognized government of President Abdrabbuh Mansour Hadi into exile. The crisis escalated dramatically in March 2015 when Saudi Arabia, fearing Iranian influence through the Houthis, launched Operation Decisive Storm, a military intervention aimed at restoring Hadi's government. The United States, under President Obama, quickly pledged support for the Saudi-led coalition, viewing the conflict through the lens of broader regional competition with Iran. American involvement has primarily consisted of intelligence sharing, logistical support, aerial refueling of coalition aircraft, and weapons sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The U.S. has also provided targeting assistance for coalition airstrikes, though American officials have consistently emphasized that targeting decisions remain with coalition partners. The conflict has created what the United Nations calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Over 370,000 people have died from direct and indirect causes of war, including disease and famine. Approximately 24 million Yemenis, 80% of the population, require humanitarian assistance, and millions face acute food insecurity. American support for the coalition has drawn intense criticism due to civilian casualties from airstrikes on schools, hospitals, markets, and other civilian infrastructure. Notable incidents include the 2016 bombing of a funeral hall in Sana'a that killed over 140 people and the 2018 airstrike on a school bus that killed 40 children. The humanitarian crisis and civilian casualties have sparked congressional opposition to U.S. involvement. In 2019, Congress passed a resolution to end American military support for the coalition, though President Trump vetoed the measure. President Biden has since ended support for offensive operations while maintaining defensive assistance. The conflict has also featured direct U.S. military action against Houthi forces, particularly after attacks on American naval vessels in the Red Sea. In 2016, U.S. destroyers USS Mason and USS Ponce came under missile attack, prompting retaliatory strikes against Houthi radar sites. The Yemen conflict highlights the challenges of proxy warfare, alliance relationships, and humanitarian concerns in American foreign policy. It continues to test the balance between strategic partnerships and human rights considerations in U.S. Middle East policy. Global War on Terror, 2001 to present. The global war on terror represents the most comprehensive and enduring military campaign in American history, spanning over 2 decades and encompassing operations across multiple continents. Launched by President George W. Bush following the September 11, 2001 attacks, this broad counterterrorism strategy has fundamentally reshaped American foreign policy, military doctrine, and domestic security measures. The campaign extends far beyond the major conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, encompassing a worldwide network of military operations, intelligence gathering, diplomatic initiatives, and law enforcement cooperation. Countries across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East have hosted American counterterrorism operations, ranging from small-scale special operations raids to sustained drone campaigns. In Pakistan, the U.S. has conducted over 400 drone strikes since 2004, targeting al-Qaeda and Taliban leadership while straining relations with the Pakistani government. The most significant operation occurred in May 2011 when Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, delivering justice for the 9/11 attacks and eliminating the world's most wanted terrorist. African operations have expanded significantly, with American forces conducting training missions, counterterrorism operations, and drone strikes across the Sahel region. Countries including Somalia, Niger, Mali, and Libya have seen varying degrees of U.S. military involvement as terrorist organizations like al-Shabaab and affiliates of al-Qaeda and ISIS have established footholds across the continent. The Philippines has hosted American Special Operations Forces assisting in counterinsurgency operations against Abu Sayyaf and other terrorist groups. This cooperation demonstrates the global nature of the campaign and the importance of partner nation capacity building in counterterrorism strategy. Syria became a major theater following the rise of ISIS, with American forces conducting airstrikes, supporting Syrian Democratic Forces, and maintaining a presence to counter both ISIS and Iranian influence. The complexity of the Syrian conflict, involving multiple state and non-state actors, illustrates the challenges of modern counterterrorism operations. The human and financial costs of the global war on terror have been staggering. Over 7,000 American service members have died in Iraq and Afghanistan alone, with hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties across all theaters. Financial costs exceed $6 trillion when including veterans' care and interest on war-related debt. The campaign has achieved significant successes, including the elimination of key terrorist leaders, disruption of attack planning, and prevention of major terrorist attacks on American soil. However, it has also faced criticism for mission creep, civilian casualties, and the proliferation of terrorist groups in new regions. As the war enters its 3rd decade, debates continue about its scope, effectiveness, and ultimate objectives, reflecting broader questions about America's role in global security and the appropriate tools for combating international terrorism. Thank you very much for watching this video, and if you learned something, make sure to leave a like, comment down below your thoughts on any of the wars I discussed in this video, and subscribe if you would like to see more like this one. Thank you again, and goodbye.